Hello. What is your name and who are you speaking on behalf of?
My name's Jim Neubold. I'm speaking on behalf of my father, uh, James C. Neubold Sr. Uh, his picture is here on the wall, along with his some of his military medals and his flag and his license plate.
And what significance does the license plate have?
Well, the license plate has quite a bit of significance, really. The significance of the license plate is that basically it brought out the story that I never knew. Um, Veterans, for some reason, don't relay a lot of information about their experiences. And what they do relay, you have to drag out of them. I asked my father many questions about the war, what he did, where he was, and the answers I got were always fairly short. I guess I was looking for war stories, and he wasn't going to give me any. And Pennsylvania decided that they were going to honor prisoners of war, World War II, with these license plates. And he decided to apply for one. And the number is actually the order in which they received the application. So he would have been the 10th one in the state to receive one of these license plates. Somehow the Sentinel got a hold of information that he was going to receive this license plate and decided to do an interview with him for the paper. And I remember seeing it going on, you know. I had asked what it was all about, and well, the rest is in the article. And I guess the license plate to him bore a lot of significance. I guess it was maybe he could show that he was a prisoner of war without actually saying it to somebody, you know, but he was very honored by receiving this license plate. So I have the story, and what I would like to do is I'd like to read you the story. You got to understand these are his words as relayed through a reporter. But it's very interesting, very, very interesting. And this would have been, well, this is more than I ever knew before. So, in his own words through a reporter, it says here, Lankerville, the story of Jim Neubold, 2nd Street. Is a fascinating one. Neubold served as a private in the United States Army during World War II and was captured and held as a prisoner of war by the Germans. It wasn't the greatest experience a fella could have, he told Sentinel last week. Neubold and Agnes, his wife of 42 years, have 2 children, Linda and James Jr., 4 grandchildren, 1 great-grandchild. At the time of World War II, James Jr. was not born and Linda was but a toddler. On February 22nd, 1944, Neubold was drafted and assigned to the 87th Reconnaissance Cavalry Squadron. He described the 87th as a bastard squadron that was always being loaned out.
And how old was your father when you entered the war?
He was 23 years old.
Did your father participate in any famous battles during the war?
Participate, he was close to participating in the Battle of the Bulge. But but as I go on here in the story, you'll see that he didn't quite make it.
Can you tell me the circumstances in which your father became a prisoner of war?
Yes, I can. In fact, that's the next section of the story. The story of Neubold's capture and imprisonment begins about 10 months after he entered the service. On December 17th, 1944, Neubold arrived with his squadron at St. Vith, Belgium. As they were arriving, the 106th Infantry Division was pulling out with all of its equipment. With the departure of the 106th, Neubold's squadron was cut off in St. Vith for about 3 days, meaning they were surrounded basically. On the evening of December 20th, Neubold's squadron leader asked for volunteers to deliver ammunition to the outpost located not far from the village. Naturally, there were no volunteers, so he, the leader, said, you, and you. And I was automatically volunteered, Neubold said. Not much of a choice. After dark, the three men started out in a jeep on their mission. Outside the village, someone put up a flare. Yeah. And the three volunteers saw Germans all around them. They immediately got out of the jeep and ran for cover in the woods. The men were separated, and Neubold said he never heard of his two comrades again. So they got separated. After stumbling around in the dark woods for a short time, Neubold literally ran into the 7th Armored Infantry Division. The 7th was dug in for expected action, so Neubold attempted to join them. He called into one foxhole and asked if there was room for him. The reply was negative, but he was told to search around for an empty foxhole. Neubold discovered a foxhole and dove for cover when the Germans began their drive with an airburst. So they started an attack. Mm-hmm. Feeling totally exhausted, Neubold was soon asleep. He recalled hearing voices faintly about 4 a.m., but felt as if he were dreaming. He awoke totally about 7 or 8 and was disturbed by the quiet in the world in which he had found himself. So, I mean, all of a sudden you're alone. There wasn't even a bird chirping. I stood up and was half covered with snow. I didn't even know it was snowing. There wasn't a soul around. I sat back down and thought, what the devil's going on, he said. It was then that Neubold heard something and decided to investigate. After getting his bearings, he quietly went through the woods and discovered that he was above the outpost. The outpost he's talking of is the one that they were headed for, mm-hmm. with the ammunition. Neubold heard a Tiger tank coming up the road, so he hid under a fallen pine tree. The tank passed by him, loaded with Germans that he said appeared to be drunk. They drove directly to the outpost, and Neubold knew the terrible predicament in which he found himself. So that he had to be pretty doggone close to that tank. Mm-hmm. The squadron outpost had been taken by the Germans, and the 7th Armored Infantry Division had apparently pulled out during the night to avoid capture by the overwhelming number of Germans. So, you got to remember, this is the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, this is when the Germans were making their push. Mm-hmm. So things were happening really very quickly. When they were pulled up into St. Vith, and the 106 was coming out. So that would have been right around the beginning of the battle. Let's see, the squadron outpost had been taken by the Germans. The 7th had apparently pulled out. Neubold was alone in a war-torn foreign land surrounded by the enemy. He hurried back to his foxhole to assess the situation and decide what to do. On his way, he saw a farmhouse in a clearing with a German scout car pulled up in the front. He watched and soon saw German guards escorting 3 American GIs from the house. After witnessing this capture, Neubold said he hurriedly took cover. Several hours later, he heard voices coming towards him. He listened carefully and was overjoyed when he heard the men speaking English. He made his presence known to the 3 Americans and learned that 2 were from the 106th Infantry. That would have been the group that he joined. Or, I'm sorry, the 106th is the group that pulled out of St. Fit. And the other one was part of an engineering group. The 3 men told Neubold that their outfit had pulled out during the night and they didn't know it. They were on the way to the outpost to report for duty. So they knew where that outpost was, and they were trying to reassociate themselves there. Neubold told them of his adventure and also informed them of their current situation. The 3 joined him in his hiding place, and by evening they were joined by 4 more lost Americans. The 8 men decided to try to slip through the lines that evening, the night of December 21st, 22nd, 1944. The engineer knew the terrain the best, so he was immediately elected as guide. He led the other 7 men down into a ravine and then saw that it was impossible to break through the lines at that point. The men decided to get back into the woods for cover while thinking of a new plan of escape. It was at this point that a flare went up, illuminating the sky brilliantly. The Americans saw 2 Tiger tanks sitting on top of the ravine above them, with German guards patrolling the area. Unfortunately, the Germans also saw them and demanded their surrender. With the only other alternative open to the Americans being death, they surrendered. My dad told me at that point, he did relate a story about that moment. I don't know where he was, but he knew there was other GIs behind him. And when they seen that basically they were surrounded, he feared somebody in back of him was going to shoot. And he knew if somebody shot that it was going to break loose. Things weren't going to be good. And he feared that the most. He, instantly thought, I hope nobody else fires, They were caught totally off guard. Okay. The Germans took the prisoners to a grouping area where there were already about 25 prisoners. The Americans gave their name, rank, and serial numbers, then sat back to wait for morning. Neubold recalled it was snowing and quite cold that night. The German guards were constantly harassing the prisoners and even took some of their shoes, making them walk in their galoshes. When morning came, the prisoners were taken to a little town that was a major regrouping area for the prisoners. Upon the arrival, the American Air Force began to bomb the hamlet. Neubold said he dove into the cellar window for cover and hid for 10 to 15 minutes while the raid was in progress. After the raid, the Germans quickly regrouped the prisoners and took them to the town's railroad station. There were many prisoners at the station when the new prisoners arrived. Neubold noticed that there were majors, colonels, and even chaplains among the swelling ranks of prisoners. The American colonels were pleading with the Germans to allow the prisoners to walk to their destination and not be forced into railroad boxcars. The colonels knew that the American Air Force loved to bomb German trains, and they did not wish to be locked aboard a train that was an easy target. They didn't. Usually, what they were required to do was paint a red cross on the cars that had prisoners of war in them and what have you. So, but these weren't marked. The Germans finally relented, and the march began. No one had expected it to last for about 17 days and nights, practically non-stop without food or water. That's a tough go. According to Neubold, the march was pure hell. Continuous walking and arguing going on with no food to be had. He used to run into fields and pick up sugar beets to eat. The snow had started to go away, and sometimes there were frozen apples by the road to eat. Okay, the several thousand prisoners received from their captors only one meal of blood pudding during the entire 17-day trek. When the prisoners arrived in Cologne, Germany, they had to cross the Rhine River. The bridge was full of bomb holes, and the men had to be extremely careful. Upon reaching the other side, the men were totally exhausted and couldn't move another step, so the Germans allowed them to rest for a couple of hours. When it was again time to move, many of them couldn't stand, and Neubold recalled that it took the Germans about an hour to get everybody on their feet. It was at this time that the prisoners were forced to crawl into boxcars, regardless of their desire to walk. 72 men were crowded into each 40 and 8 boxcars for several days and nights with no food or water. Neubold recalled that all they could do was stand. The train stopped at stations along the way, and it was at these stations that the men learned how cruel and callous a man can be. German citizens would crowd around the boxcars and promise the prisoners bread in exchange for their watches. Several of the prisoners gladly relinquished their watches for the promised bread. However, the food scraps never arrived. After receiving the prisoners' watches and other trinkets, the citizens would scamper off merrily, never to be seen again. Neubold recalled an elderly German woman who was kind at one station. The prisoners would hand their helmets to her, and she would fill them with snow, which would melt into water for the thirsty men. When she was performing this task, German guards saw her and ordered her away. One guard hit the woman and knocked her to the ground. The woman was at least in her 70s. It was hard to believe that they were doing things like that to their own people, Neubold said. The train finally stopped for good, and the prisoners were unloaded and taken to a delousing place. The men were put into a building and stripped. They were then given clothing and dog tags and put into stalags. It was in 3 different stalags. I was in 3 different stalags while I was held prisoner, and the meal was always the same: 1 boiled potato a day. If you were in line and were given one that was half rotten, that was your own problem. You weren't given another one, Neubold told the Sentinel. It was in one of these prison camps that Neubold decided he'd rather be working. The Germans had put up notices that stated a man who worked would get several meals a day. Neubold was accustomed to working and was becoming quite disenchanted with just sitting around all day, so he signed up for a labor force with 63 other men. The men were placed at Hugo Reichert's planing mill in Leipzig. Neubold ran a tongue and groove machine, among other things. The mill was in the process of constructing prefab building material for military use. Before the American prisoners were placed at the mill, Russian prisoners were stationed there. They were in the process of building a huge bomb shelter with railroad tracks going right inside. The Germans were expecting a massive air raid and wished to save as much of the mill equipment as possible. After construction of the shelter was complete, the machinery was moved in and sealed off. Neubold described the barracks as being adequate and having a bedroom, a dining area, showers, and outdoor privies. The promised meals were another story. No breakfast was served. The dinner consisted of a bowl of grass and hard bean soup. The evening meal was simply a square inch of blood pudding and some bread, but never any meat. During his entire imprisonment, the only meat Neubold ever had came in the form of spam in Red Cross parcels that were shared by 17 men. Neubold has many memories of the planing mill and the work he did there. He recalled that at times he was required to unload wood. The barky and unusable pieces were thrown to the side. The German guards wouldn't even allow private German citizens to collect the scrap for use as firewood. A kind elderly lady lived next to the mill, and the American prisoners knew that she didn't have enough wood to burn to keep herself warm. Neubold and his unloading partner always threw the wood over her fence when the guards weren't looking. One day the woman came out into her yard and slipped 2 crusts of bread with a sweet topping through the fence to the Americans. Neubold recalled that treat was delicious, and he was truly grateful. At that time, everything tasted good, he said.
Do you remember any specific stories your father used to tell?
I do remember one. He said occasionally when they would march him from place to place, they would take these Air Force or Army Air Force guys, flyers. They could have been anything, gunners, navigators, whatever, but they always tried to keep them in the middle of the pack, hidden. He said if they didn't, what would happen was the civilians would throw rocks at them, run up and hit them with wood or whatever, because these guys were in the bombers that were tearing up their cities at this time. So it was a way for them to strike back. But that was one of the stories. Plus, always being cold, very cold and hungry, of course. That's about it. I'll continue here. By mid-March 1945, Neubold and his comrades had adjusted somewhat to their new life. One day, they were out on a work detail when a well-dressed man came up to them and asked if any of them were from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The gentleman wore a black armband, and the prisoners soon learned that he was an officer in the German army and was wounded in Stalingrad. Neubold told the officer that he lived to the north of Harrisburg. "Do you know where York, Pennsylvania is?" the officer replied. Neubold said that he knew where York was, and the officer immediately explained that he lived in York and that his wife and son were still there. He said that he had worked for Procter & Gamble and was called back to Germany at the beginning of the war. The officer befriended the prisoners and began coming to their camp to visit them. On each visit, he would take something to make the Americans' lives more bearable. Among his gifts were dice, Life magazines, and cards. On his visits, the prisoners would also learn of the war, and then they could expect to be liberated. As time wore on, the prisoners looked forward to Easter and its rebirth promise. Their officer friend decided to surprise them with an Easter present. He arranged for the men to have a keg of black beer as an Easter treat and also have Easter Monday off. Neubold and his 40 remaining comrades were totally surprised and grateful for the gentleman's kindness and generosity. Around Easter, the planing mill was blown up. The Americans were forced out to fight fires before the raid was over. The city around them was nothing but rubble. So now you can understand why the civilians didn't like the Air Force guys too well. It was about this time that a plane flew overhead, dropping pamphlets. The pamphlets encouraged the prisoners to hang in there and also informed them of the death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. On April 17, 1945, between 8 and 10 a.m., the prisoners saw a jeep and a tank coming through the streets toward them. In the jeep was an American lieutenant, a driver, and a gunner, all members of the 9th Armored Division. The long months of imprisonment were over.
So how long was your father a prisoner of war?
My father was a prisoner of war roughly 5 months.
And even with the hardship your father suffered in the war, do you think he felt it was a worthwhile cause?
Oh, yes, definitely. There's no doubt in my mind. He definitely believed in the cause. I'm sure he wouldn't have wanted to, but if he had to go over it again, he probably would.
Okay. Is there anything else you want to add?
Yeah, I can finish the article here. The Americans, okay, this is after the imprisonment's over. The Americans were marched to a grouping area, and the Red Cross served coffee and donuts. Several days later, Neubold was in Le Havre, France, boarding a ship bound for New York. Upon his arrival in New York, Neubold called the home of a neighbor in Millersburg, since Agnes had no telephone. He was soon talking to his wife and thought his troubles were over. It was during the course of the conversation that Neubold was informed that his brother Gene had been killed. Neubold soon left for Harrisburg. When he arrived at the station, he saw his wife and his brother Ed, but they walked right by him. He called to them, but they simply stared back at him. Neubold had left for the war clean-shaven, weighing 230 pounds and having a 42-inch waistline. He returned with a mustache and a 28-inch waistline. It was understandable why they didn't recognize him. Agnes Neubold recalled that she was quite shocked when she learned that the tall, yellow, sickly-looking man was her husband. But she was determined to continue their relationship where they had left off. She was going to pick up the pieces and fit them back together. This turned out to be harder than Agnes had initially expected. For the first several weeks after he came home, Neubold dove for cover whenever a plane went overhead. He tossed and turned during the night and found it hard to sleep under his own roof. As a result of this nightmare, Neubold made several promises to himself that he has kept to this day. He swore that he would never be hungry or cold again. And that's the end of the article.
Okay, thank you very much. It was very interesting, and thank you for sharing your father's experiences with us.
You're welcome.
Thank you.